They never collapse suddenly. No empire wakes up one morning and discovers it has fallen. Instead, there is always a moment, quiet, almost invisible, when the pattern begins. A moment when the warning signs appear, not as catastrophes, but as subtle distortions in the system. A shift in the currency, a fracture in the political structure, a tension in the borders, a widening gap between the story a nation tells itself and the reality tightening around it. Every empire in history, from Rome to the Ming Dynasty, from the Ottomans to the British, from global monarchies to modern superpowers, experienced the same 8 signals right before their decline accelerated beyond reversal. And here is the most terrifying truth. They all ignored them, not because they didn't see them, but because they believed, with absolute conviction, that they were different. Rome believed its legions made it immortal. The Ottomans believed their territory made them untouchable. The British believed their navy made them permanent. And today, the United States believes its currency and military make it immune to the laws that humbled every empire before it. But history doesn't care about belief, it cares about mathematics, about incentives, about the mechanics of power and decay, dynamics that have repeated for 3,000 years with unnerving precision across all eras, all cultures, all geographies. The first warning signs always look deceptively harmless. A slight rise in debt, a measure of political polarization, a shift in military spending, a temporary trade imbalance. Leaders reassure the public that everything is under control, that the difficulties are cyclical, that the system is resilient, that the empire has weathered storms before. But what they never acknowledge is the deeper pattern. Empires don't collapse because of one crisis. They collapse because they accumulate too many warnings and ignore every single one. And the 8 warnings that preceded every imperial decline are not dramatic events. They are invisible thresholds. Cross them, and the decline becomes structural, not political, mathematical, not ideological, inevitable, not avoidable. The truth is brutally simple. Empires die the same way, not through invasion, not through rebellion, but through erosion. Slow, silent, and ignored until the turning point arrives. And right now, in 2025, the United States is exhibiting all 8 signs simultaneously, a convergence that has not happened since the late-stage British Empire in the 1930s or Rome in the 4th century. This video is not about prediction. It is not about doom. It is about pattern recognition, because once you understand these 8 signals, how they appeared, how they were dismissed, and how quickly they accelerated after being ignored, you will understand the single law that governs the rise and fall of every empire. Collapse is never sudden. Collapse is earned, one warning at a time. Let's go back to the beginning, to the moment when empires still believed they were invincible, yet the first cracks had already begun to spread beneath their foundations. This is where the story really starts. To understand the 8 warning signs empires ignore, we have to return to a moment when an empire stood at its peak, powerful, wealthy, confident, yet already fatally wounded in ways its citizens could not see. Let's go back to Rome, the year 376 AD. On the surface, it was still the greatest superpower the world had ever known. The imperial borders stretched across 3 continents. Roman gold flowed through Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. The legions were feared everywhere. The emperors still walked through marble palaces lit by torches that burned without interruption. To an ordinary Roman citizen, nothing looked fragile, in fact. Everything looked permanent. But beneath the glittering surface, something had shifted. A series of invisible fractures, economic, political, demographic, had begun weakening the empire decades earlier. Most Romans did not recognize them. The Senate ignored them. The elites profited from them. And by the time anyone realized the danger, the cycle had already passed the point of reversal. This is what makes imperial decline so difficult to detect. It begins not with collapse, but with prosperity. Always. Rome in 376 AD was still wealthier, but the wealth was hollow. Trade was still active, but increasingly unbalanced. The military was still powerful, but incredibly expensive. The bureaucracy was still functioning, but swollen far beyond sustainability. When the Visigoths appeared at the Danube River that year, begging to be allowed inside Roman territory, the empire believed it could manage the problem easily. But the true problem wasn't the tribes at the border. The true problem was the underlying weakness the empire refused to confront. This moment, an empire convinced of its strength, yet structurally compromised, repeats throughout history. Travel forward to the Ming Dynasty, 1590, China was still the most advanced civilization on Earth. Their porcelain, silk, and metalwork dominated global trade. The imperial court was vast, refined, and confident. But something else was happening beneath the surface. Silver shortages were destabilizing the currency. Famine and plague were increasing internal migration. Local officials were becoming corrupt as the central state struggled to collect taxes. On the outside, China looked invincible. On the inside, the Ming economy was fracturing, just like Rome. Now moved to Ottoman Istanbul, 1780. The empire still controlled vital trade routes. The Sultan still commanded the Janissaries. The palaces still gleamed along the Bosphorus. But European powers were industrializing faster. The Ottoman bureaucracy was aging. The military was technologically stagnant, and inflation was quietly destroying purchasing power across the empire. Again, the same pattern. The warning signs appear long before the collapse becomes visible. And then, the British Empire, 1930. The sun technically never set on British territory. London was still the financial center of the world. The pound was still the global reserve currency. But Britain was drowning in war debt. Industrial competitors, Germany, Japan, and the United States, were catching up. Maintaining global bases, fleets, and colonies was becoming financially impossible. The empire looked dominant right up until it wasn't. This is the critical truth viewers must understand. Empires never fall from a clear, single event. They fall from a long accumulation of ignored warnings. Warnings that look small at first, insignificant, manageable. Border pressures in Rome looked like minor refugee problems. Currency distortions in the Ming dynasty looked like temporary shortages. Military stagnation in the Ottoman Empire looked like a fixable administrative issue. British overspending looked like a post-war hangover. But in reality, these were the earliest signals in the same predictable pattern. The pattern of decline that every empire follows. And now, in our time, another empire is standing at the same precipice. The United States, wealthy, powerful, technologically dominant, but showing the same structural fractures beneath its surface. Before we identify the 8 warning signs directly, we need to see how they manifested historically. Because once we follow the pattern through multiple empires, one thing becomes unavoidable. The warnings always come first. The fall comes later. But the moment the warnings appear, the process is already in motion. Next, we examine the case studies: Rome, Ming China, the Ottomans, and the British Empire, each revealing how the same 8 warnings appeared, escalated, and were ignored. This is where the pattern becomes undeniable. Empires collapse in different eras, in different cultures, for different reasons. Yet when you peel back the details, the mechanism is always the same. The same 8 warnings emerge. The same assumptions blind the ruling class. The same sequence unfolds, gradually, then suddenly. Take Rome. Its decline didn't begin when barbarians breached the gates. It began decades earlier, inside the empire's own financial and political architecture. The Roman military consumed nearly all state revenue, an impossible burden for a system stretched across continents. To pay for it, Rome raised taxes until citizens could no longer bear them, then debased its currency until the silver content fell to almost nothing. Confidence deteriorated quietly, like a foundation rotting beneath a palace that still looked magnificent on the outside. Politics fractured. Generals fought for power. Loyalty shifted from the state to individual commanders. Borders strained under migratory pressure, and when the Visigoths finally reached the Danube in 376 AD, Rome treated them not as future citizens, but as a threat to be contained. The empire mishandled their integration so catastrophically that the newcomers eventually marched on Rome itself. But the collapse didn't start at the gates. It started decades earlier, with ignored warnings. A similar pattern unfolded in Ming China. By the late 1500s, China was still the center of global trade, but its monetary system depended entirely on imported silver. When silver flows from Japan and the Americas slowed, the Chinese money supply imploded, prices soared, taxes went unpaid. Local officials, already corrupt, squeezed peasants even harder to make up shortfalls. The state, unable to stabilize its currency or feed its population during climate-driven agricultural failures, became increasingly disconnected from reality. Rebellions multiplied. When Li Zicheng's forces entered Beijing in 1644, the dynasty collapsed with stunning speed because its internal structure had already given way. Even the Ottoman Empire, which lasted 6 centuries, followed the same arc of decline. While Europe industrialized, The Ottoman military resisted modernization. The Janissaries clung to their privileges. Wars against Europe drained the treasury and forced the empire into heavy borrowing. European creditors gained enormous leverage over Ottoman finances, a loss of economic sovereignty that accelerated political weakness. Inflation surged as rulers debased the currency to finance deficits. Provincial uprisings spread as central authority weakened. The empire still looked vast on a map, but its internal coherence was dissolving. And then there was Britain, the first modern superpower in the early 20th century. Its empire spanned the globe, but the cost of maintaining such a vast structure exceeded its economic capacity. World War I pushed Britain into unmanageable debt. Maintaining the gold standard strangled its economy until the pound finally broke in 1931, a warning far louder than any parliamentary debate. Meanwhile, industrial competitors like the United States and Germany overtook Britain in steel, manufacturing, and technology. Political divisions paralyzed decision-making, preserve the empire, reform it, or dismantle it. By the time World War II arrived, the empire no longer had the financial or industrial strength to sustain its global footprint. The collapse was inevitable, not because of a single event, but because every warning had been ignored for too long. 4 empires, 4 different civilizations, 4 timelines separated by centuries, yet the same pattern repeats. Unsustainable costs, monetary distortion, political fragmentation, declining competitiveness, rising internal unrest, mismanaged borders, and leadership too confident to confront the truth. And now, for the first time in modern history, all 8 warning signs are appearing simultaneously inside one nation, the United States. That convergence is where history stops being academic and becomes a mirror. The next part examines these 8 signals directly and shows exactly how they manifest in America today. For most Americans, the idea that the United States could follow the same path as Rome, the Ming Dynasty, the Ottomans, or the British Empire still feels impossible. The country has the world's largest economy, the strongest military, the most advanced technology, and the global reserve currency. On the surface, the American system appears too dynamic, too innovative, too central to global trade to ever face true decline. But that is exactly what every empire believed at this stage, because imperial decline isn't obvious in real time. It begins slowly, invisibly, through internal distortions that accumulate long before the public feels the consequences. And today, those distortions are no longer theoretical. They are measurable. They are structural. They are accelerating, and they align perfectly with the same 8 warnings that appeared before every major imperial collapse in recorded history. The first warning is already embedded in the national balance sheet. The United States now carries more sovereign debt than any nation in human history. Debt that once expanded in cycles now climbs in straight lines. Debt that once served national growth now exceeds national output. Debt that once could be financed inexpensively now requires interest payments larger than the entire defense budget. Empires do not fall because they borrow. They fall because the mathematics of borrowing eventually turn against them. Suddenly, decisively, irreversibly. But debt is only the surface symptom. Underneath, it is a deeper structural problem. A currency losing purchasing power faster than wages can adjust. The dollar remains dominant globally. But domestically, it is weakening in the same way late-stage imperial currencies always weaken. Slow erosion, rising costs, political promises funded by money creation, and a public increasingly aware that something fundamental isn't working. When a nation relies on printing to stabilize its systems, the systems themselves are already unstable. At the same time, political fragmentation is widening to levels not seen in generations. The United States is no longer divided between parties. It is divided between realities. Every empire reaches a moment where internal cohesion breaks down, where institutions lose credibility, where citizens no longer agree on basic facts, and once consensus disappears, governance becomes reactive, not strategic. Rome faced this before its fall, so did the Ottomans, so did Britain. The United States is now entering the same phase, where political energy is spent fighting internally rather than projecting stability externally. The military, still the strongest on Earth, faces its own imperial paradox. The burden of maintaining global presence is rising, while the ability to finance that burden is eroding. Bases, fleets, missions, alliances, the costs increase endlessly, while public support, industrial capacity, and fiscal room to maneuver weaken. This is what destroyed the British Empire. not a lack of capability, but a mismatch between ambition and solvency. Meanwhile, America's strategic position is being challenged in ways no post-war generation has experienced. Rival powers, China, Russia, Iran, are exploiting moments of American distraction. Non-state actors destabilize entire regions faster than the U.S. can respond. All empires eventually confront adversaries who sense vulnerability. What determines survival is whether the empire can correct its internal weaknesses before external pressure becomes overwhelming. But perhaps the most dangerous signal is the fracture of the American middle class. When a nation's economic foundation shifts from production to speculation, from broad prosperity to concentrated wealth, the social contract erodes. Rome's middle class collapsed under tax pressure. The Ming middle class collapsed during monetary failure. The Ottoman middle class collapsed during inflationary stagnation. Every time, inequality was not the cause, it was the warning. A signal that the empire had moved from productive expansion to extractive maintenance. Today, in the United States, real wages stagnate while asset prices skyrocket. Housing becomes inaccessible. Corporate insiders sell at the top while retail investors buy at the peak. These are not random market behaviors. They are late-cycle imperial signals. And then there is the most subtle warning of all, a growing disconnect between the story America tells itself and the reality unfolding beneath it. Every empire reaches a moment when its self-image stops matching its internal condition, a moment when confidence becomes denial and denial becomes policy. This is the point at which decline stops being a possibility and becomes a trajectory. The United States has not collapsed. It has not fallen. It remains a global superpower. But the warnings, all 8 of them, are now visible simultaneously. Debt, currency erosion, political fragmentation, imperial overstretch, declining industrial resilience, structural inequality, external rivals, and internal disbelief. If history teaches anything, it is this. When the signs appear together, the decline has already begun. Not the collapse, the decline. Subtle at first, then accelerating until the system reaches a point where the old mechanisms no longer work and the new mechanisms arrive too late. And that acceleration phase is exactly what comes next. Every empire in history reached a moment when decline shifted from slow erosion to rapid acceleration, a tipping point where the forces that once stabilized the system begin to destabilize it instead. Rome reached it in the 4th century. The Ottomans reached it in the 19th. Britain reached it between the world wars. The United States is approaching that moment now. What makes this period different and far more dangerous is the speed at which decline compounds in a fully globalized, fully financialized, fully interconnected world. Earlier empires had decades, sometimes centuries. To adapt, modern empires have years, sometimes only months. Acceleration begins when internal pressures collide with external shocks in a system already stretched to its limits. And today, America's core stabilizers, the dollar, the financial markets, the technological edge, the military presence, the demographic base, are becoming amplifiers of volatility instead of buffers against it. Start with technology. In previous cycles, information moved slowly. It took years for political fractures, financial stress, or military weakness to spread through a society. But today, information moves at the speed of light. Fear spreads faster than solutions. Narratives outpace institutions. Digital markets respond not in months, but in milliseconds. A single rumor can erase billions. A single policy misstep can ripple across the world in minutes. This compression of time turns every warning sign into a cascading event, every structural weakness into a real-time crisis. The financial system accelerates the process even more. The U.S. economy is now built on layers of leverage, derivatives, and liquidity mechanisms that require constant confidence to function. When confidence weakens, even slightly, the system does not slow down, it destabilizes. Interest rates rise faster, borrowing costs compound, asset prices react violently. Debt that was manageable at 2% becomes catastrophic at 6%. This is the math that crushed empires before. Only now it moves with mechanical speed. And, unlike past empires, the United States holds the world's reserve currency, which makes the consequences of instability far larger. When America faces internal stress, the entire world feels it. A dollar spike tightens global credit conditions. A dollar crash destabilizes foreign reserves. Every nation linked to U.S. financial markets becomes a transmission channel. This level of global interdependence has never existed before, and it means the margin for error is nearly zero. Geopolitics adds another layer of acceleration. As American internal cohesion weakens, rival powers see opportunity. They push at the edges, small moves, strategic probes, incremental challenges, knowing the U.S. must now stretch its resources thinner than ever. Russia tests Europe's security architecture. China moves in the South China Sea and across global supply chains. Iran expands influence through proxy networks. These are not isolated events. They are coordinated pressures probing for systemic weaknesses. Every empire in decline experiences this, but today's adversaries act faster, armed with better intelligence, cyber capabilities, and global networks than any previous great power rival. Demographics contribute to the acceleration as well. For the first time in modern history, the United States is aging without replacing its workforce rapidly enough. An older population increases entitlement costs just as tax revenues stagnate. This widens fiscal deficits, intensifies political conflict, and accelerates the need for new borrowing, creating a feedback loop that pushes the debt curve steeper each year. Empires do not collapse because they age. They collapse because aging makes their financial structure unviable. Then there is social trust, the invisible infrastructure that no empire can survive without. Once trust declines, institutions lose legitimacy. Once legitimacy declines, governance loses effectiveness. And once governance loses effectiveness, stability breaks down from within. Social trust is collapsing faster now than in any previous American era, amplified by digital echo chambers, ideological sorting, and a media ecosystem built to divide, not unify. Without trust, even correct decisions fail because no one believes them. But the most powerful accelerator is something far simpler: speed itself. The world is faster, money is faster, markets are faster, information is faster, crises are faster. Decline, once a slow-moving force, has become a rapid one. Rome could take 200 years to decay. Britain could take 50. A modern superpower could face a full cycle of rise, dominance, and decline in half a century. And once an empire enters the acceleration phase, the space for correction shrinks drastically. Policies that once could have reversed the trend become insufficient. Reforms that once could have stabilized the system barely slow it down. Momentum takes over. That is where the United States now stands, on the edge of a transition from slow decay to rapid acceleration, a point where the 8 warning signs no longer operate independently, but converge, reinforce, and compound one another. Debt amplifies political division. Division undermines economic policy. Weak policy shakes global confidence. Loss of confidence destabilizes markets. Markets push borrowing costs higher. Higher costs feed back into the debt, and the cycle accelerates. Every empire reaches this moment. Most do not recognize it. Even fewer survive it. And what comes after the acceleration phase is the inevitable. Every empire believes it has more time, more strength, more margin for error, more runway before the consequences arrive. But history shows something far colder. Once the acceleration phase begins, the trajectory becomes irreversible, not instantly, not catastrophically at first, but inevitably. Decline is not a cliff, it is a slope so subtle that most citizens don't realize they've descended until the landscape around them has already changed. Institutions still function, but less effectively. Markets still operate, but with more fragility. Politics still continues, but with more bitterness. The system still stands, but its internal logic has shifted from expansion to preservation, from preservation to exhaustion. And this is where empires reach the final stage, the point where the pressures they once controlled begin to control them. For the United States, this doesn't look like foreign armies landing on its shores. Imperial collapses in the modern era do not happen through invasion. They happen through internal dislocation, financial, political, social, until the empire no longer has the capacity, credibility, or cohesion to maintain its global role. The end of an empire is the moment when its currency ceases to be the unquestioned foundation of the global system. When its military presence becomes a strain instead of a stabilizer. When its political class can no longer produce consensus. When its economic engine depends more on debt than productivity, more on perception than fundamentals. When the population is divided into competing realities, each convinced the other is the threat, it does not collapse in a single moment. It fades into a new equilibrium, smaller, less dominant, less central, just as Britain did after World War II, just as the Ottomans did after the 19th century, just as Rome did when it ceased to be the axis of the world and became merely another kingdom fighting for survival. The United States remains powerful, it remains wealthy, it remains innovative, but the warning signs, all 8 of them, signal a shift in historical phase, a transition from imperial confidence to imperial constraint. And once a system crosses that threshold, the outcome is governed not by politics or ideology, but by mathematics, incentives, and structural limits. Empires do not die because they are defeated. They die because they can no longer sustain the weight of what they built. Debt becomes unpayable. Currency loses credibility. Allies hedge. Rivals advance. Domestic factions harden. The system becomes too heavy to carry, too complex to reform, too divided to coordinate, too slow to adapt. This is not the fall. This is the beginning of the world that comes after. Future historians will not describe it as a collapse, but as a transition from one global center of gravity to another, from a unipolar world to a fractured one, from American-led stability to something far less predictable. And that unpredictability is the true danger. Not the end of American power, but the vacuum created by its decline. A vacuum that history shows is never peaceful, never orderly, never stable for long. We are living through the hinge of an era. The moment future generations will study the same way we study Rome in the 4th century or Britain in the 1930s, not because we want to, but because history has placed us here, in the final stage of a pattern that has repeated for thousands of years. And that is why the outcome is not mysterious, not speculative, not prophetic. It is structural. It is mathematical. It is already in motion. This is the pattern, and we're already in it.